Shitcast. I'm your host, Matt Frazier. Tonight's co-host, Eric Smith, and our guest, published author and game designer, Richard Balsley. How you doing tonight, Richard?
Good, you?
Yeah, we're doing fantastic. So we asked Richard to come on, tell us a little bit about himself, talk to us about some of the things he's passionate about. So, Richard, why don't you take some time and just kind of introduce yourself to our audience?
Okay, well, as you mentioned, I am a game designer and a writer. My background basically is centered on English, and I have a specialty degree called Humanities and Arts. Basically, I cobbled together a program that mixed film and media studies with drama to kind of look at the question of who still has ownership over storylines and things like that. And I've taught a class on how to read games as performative, narrative, and cultural media, which is just a fancy way of saying what do games teach. And I work in a library in California, and I've actually taught game design to kids at my library system.
Excellent. So I was wondering then, how did you get involved in gaming? Like, how long have you been involved in the aspect of gaming?
Well, for most of my life, to be honest, I started learning how to do game design when I was about 4 or 5. What happened was growing up in the Bay Area in the not-so-nice parts, in the shadow of the Oakland Coliseum, so anybody who lived in this area in the 80s would know, it was not really a great place to be. So there wasn't a lot of stuff to do outside. So I had an uncle who would make games on paper for us, and I would actually just watch him draw tracks, like start to finish style board games. And that's how I got my start. And then we moved on to playing things like chess and Risk and a lot of the old Avalon Hill games, some of which still had the 3M logos on them.
Right on.
And he had a collection of the first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons books, and that's pretty much how I learned to read. I mean, other than a few picture books and stuff, by the time I was old enough to be able to read on my own, I started going through the monster manuals and the old Dungeon Master's Guide. That's pretty much where it started for me in terms of game design. But I didn't think of it as a career option until after I had contacted Gary Gygax, the co-creator of Dungeons and Dragons, through his website.
So how often did you and your family participate in playing games? Was it every weekend, or was it pretty much every night? And how intense was this hobby for you at that time, or this interest?
Well, my parents divorced when I was about 3, so it was mostly it was all there was to do with my uncles, because my mom worked all the time, or for the most part. So until I went to school, it was pretty much all day, every day. It was either learning something or playing games. That was pretty much all I did.
And sometimes probably in school too, I imagine.
Oh yeah.
If you were like me,
I could get away with it.
Yeah. I mean, I came up from a similar background where it was just me and my mother, and she worked a lot. So when I randomly discovered Dungeons and Dragons, it was some of the first books that I really dug into and read. And I can attest to the fact that there are a lot of obscure words in the text.
Oh, God, yes. Some of that just threw me off so much, trying to figure out what it is I was reading. And
phylactery, imbibe, imbiber, just all these dweomercraft, dweomer, all of these words like that you just typically don't hear anywhere else.
Right, and then on top of that, you end up with things like militocracy and the old abbreviations for
All the Latin
not just
abbreviations.
IE and EG, but
for
also
example,
Viz and CF.
Yeah. Yeah, and it really, I don't know about you, but it gave me a very a big appreciation for the English language. For picking the precise word that I'm trying to use for the emotion or the thought that I carry.
Yeah, I wish I could say that.
Well, still, I do know. I still do. Go ahead.
My relationship with the English language has never been one of like, ooh, this is cool, but more along the lines of, I really hate this.
Oh, well, I have, you, as you know, probably have been going to school myself, and I've loved writing, and I've gotten A's on everything so far that I've written any papers, but I just love it, so.
Well, I mean, yeah, no, I'm the same way. I absolutely just hated English. It was my least favorite subject in school, so by the time I started tutoring in college for people, I would explain to them, like, I hated English so much I fell in love with it.
Yeah, so yeah, I had that experience with Brussels sprouts.
Yeah, I mean, I love to read books. I love stories, and that's one of the reasons why I eventually ended up getting my English degree, as well as the specialty degree that I went for, is because I love stories.
Now, what was
that's pretty much where a lot of it came from.
Could you explain that specialty degree in a bit more detail?
Yeah, so basically, the thesis that I came up with is, given the changes with technology, kind of like this podcast and a few other things, where you can do a story in small increments and get immediate feedback, the question I was examining was, who's in control? Is it the director, the writer, the actors, or does the audience own the story, since they can put their immediate input into things? And, if they don't like the direction, does that, like, doom, something that has sponsors?
Gotcha. Yeah, and that's a good point. People can make commentary on it even while it's going on or shortly thereafter. They have added to that discussion, and it's almost, in a way, like a living discussion, too. It's hard to have a stopping point for it. Would you say that would you agree with that?
Yeah, and so that was one of the things I was really interested in examining, was because I was looking at that aspect, because stories do affect us. I mean, look at all the hate that's going around for Last Jedi right now. I mean, that's a perfect example of this kind of concept, because we have social media and all these various outlets that people can use now compared to 20, 30 years ago. You have all these people who can voice their opinion or their concerns. And if they like what you're doing, they'll let you know. If they really don't like what you're doing, they definitely will let you know.
Yeah.
So you have you can see the sense of ownership that people have in stories, because they're so central to what we do and how we create our own identities.
Right. I see what you're saying. So that makes any story that you conceive of in a game sense to be really well, from that perspective, you're really thinking out how that's going to affect your players too, right?
Well, yeah, you have to, because when a character creates a persona for their game, or the game world, they're telling you what they want. I mean, it could be some reflection of themselves, or something that's completely outside of their normal behaviors, some aspect that they want to explore based off of the information that you give for the setting, for the stories, or the world for the stories are going to take place in. And if you don't deliver on that, you pretty much are going to have a lot of disappointment and frustration on the part of the players, and possibly on your own end, since it's going to be like, trying to pull teeth, when what you're really trying to do is herd cats, and trying to find a way to satisfy everybody at the table while unfolding the vision that you had.
So could you give me maybe an example of how this might play out in your typical role-playing game?
Well, okay, you always have good examples of the stereotypical players, like the thespian style player who wants to act. They really want to get into the role of the character. There's the person who just wants to roll dice, and then you always have the person who wants to basically be the sword and sorcery, Pulp Fiction style character who just kicks the door in. And all these are legitimate play styles. There's no inherently good or bad, about them. It's just a different approach to the same material. In fact, you'll see a lot of movies where you'll have a lot of these characters in an ensemble cast together, and they work well. They get on each other's nerves at the right points to drive the story and create drama and tension and all that. But if you're not prepared to handle that, it can be disastrous in a gaming format, because it's still a game, and these are hopefully people you care about enough to actually invite back to your home or to the game store every week or every 2 weeks when you play.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, and a part of why they're playing it is because they're trying to fulfill something inside of them, too.
Yeah, and that's one of the, in fact, the work that I'm trying to do towards, hopefully for a PhD at some point, has to do with the three genres of power that you see reflected in almost every game, because they have something to say about a question of agency, whether it's relationships in the face of overwhelming power, which is essentially the key component of fantasy, and that's why fantasy dominates role-playing games, because it's ultimately the purest form of expression for what it is we do when we come together to sit around a table. We're, having some sort of fellowship in this particular storytelling format where we all participate and drive the story forward. But at the same time, it says something about the relationships, not just between our characters, but between the players. And then, you also have superheroes, which kind of touches on that because it's a form of modern fantasy. And then sci-fi and westerns are, action stories.
So we've really quickly drifted into the story/game philosophy category. And, if I understand what you're saying correctly, you're speaking on things that Joseph Campbell touched upon, like people filling archetypal needs within themselves through a game and deciding to play certain aspects of those archetypes and the need to reply to that in the game so that need is fulfilled. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, that is the case. One of the topics that I covered that I posted on my website talks about this, because it's basically kitchen table theater. Like, you don't even have to play a role-playing game to have the same effect. You play Monopoly, and you always have that one person who wants to basically play the most annoying person at the table who's doing everything to be disruptive so nobody can win.
Gotcha.
And, buying properties so that way nobody can get a monopoly, anything to get back at, like, their older sibling or a parent or whatever.
And some games depend upon that, right?
Yeah, they do. I mean, like, diplomacy is, like, the perfect example. Anybody who's ever played diplomacy or knows anything about it, there's a reason why people call it the game that ruins friendships, because the game's all about being two-faced. I mean, that's literally what the game's about, because of trying to find a way to navigate through the Byzantine maze of World War I alliances that basically plunged all of Europe into the global conflict that it became.
So in reliving that, they are suffering through the same promises and betrayals of that era, correct?
In a large part, yes, but but the thing that makes it hilarious is that these are people who are supposed to be friends outside the game.
Right.
Unlike the actual diplomats who knew each other but were loyal to their countries more than they were to their friends.
So, Richard, it sounds like you're speaking from experience about the game that ruins friendships. Do you have a story that you can share about, or maybe not this game specifically, about how games can affect friendships that way?
Well, yeah, I mean, not so much diplomacy because I don't have a copy. I really do want one, but it's
Same here, man.
given that it's kind of like it's like the third rail of gaming in a lot of ways. I've just never picked up a copy. But look at games like Risk, where you can still do that. I mean, and again, I can go back to Monopoly, where people will like work together just to get somebody out. Yeah, so this is something that's inherent in all games. You see it in stories as well, where you'll have people act like this, where they're like, on the surface, they'll be your friend, but they're working against you behind the scenes.
Yeah,
So
even in cooperative games.
You're just seeing human nature in action. The difference is that with a game, you're seeing it on a small scale, and it's the competitive nature of being a human coming to the fore. It's just how badly do people want to win is what you're going to kind of see.
It's funny. I seen a meme one time on social media that it was like a coffee table that was flipped over, and there was what was left of a Monopoly game all over the floor. And the meme was how every game of Monopoly ends, right? Somebody flipping the board over.
And that's because a lot of people play it in the most frustrating way possible. If you actually play it by the rules, it's one of the most cutthroat, brutal games ever.
Yeah, I couldn't get a group of mine to play Axis and Allies with me ever because there was a couple of people that was just known for getting angry and throwing dice, and so they didn't want to play anymore.
Yeah, and so that's why I was saying, like, it's not any particular one game where this happens. It just happens more in diplomacy because that's literally what the game's about.
Right.
And that's why it's a great example of taking on these roles and the conflicts that they can create. But, I mean, you can see this all the way back into the roots of science fiction with H.G. Wells and Little Wars and the stories that he told, because the way that he wrote some of his materials, he would have his friends take on the personas of the characters that later, were the characters in his novels.
I didn't know that. That's interesting. And then he would write about what their actions were, how they handled a certain
He would
situation.
use that to help him as a reference. Yes.
Huh. Yeah, that's interesting because I was just talking the other day about how you could take a scenario in a game, unlike in a story, which had linear lines to it, that you're going to read, it's going to be the same every time, but in a role-playing game you were able to run a scenario over and over again with different people or even the same people and watch different results happen, sometimes drastically different results, and most of the time those results are based upon the way those people are integrating with each other. I definitely have seen in long-term campaigns that have lasted for like over a year of solid playing, people almost forget that they're friends sitting around the table and really in the back of their minds and reflectively and instinctively react to each other as their personas. In other words, if they know somebody has some certain ability or power that could potentially best them or hurt them, they tend to treat that person a little differently than somebody they feel doesn't have that ability.
Right, and so what they're doing is reflecting the reality of those characters. So it might be more of a subconscious thing, or they might be doing it because they know that that's how their character would react. But the effect is the same. If you knew somebody in real life who had an ability or a certain skill set that you would sometimes find yourself questioning, you might react the same way.
Agreed, yeah.
It's interesting. It's a bit of like a rudimentary form of method acting, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and that's why I mentioned Augusto Boal in the piece I wrote on kitchen table theater, because he essentially talked about this concept of the theater of the oppressed, where given the climate at the time, you couldn't really express yourself, but theater allowed people to express themselves. So when you have kids, they when they play against their parents, they get to experience equality on some level. It's where this whole concept of the magic circle in game design and academics is brought to bear, is this idea that by a social contract, somehow we're all equal during the time frame for this particular game.
Yes.
While we're in the space for the game and during the time for the game, we are considered equal.
Yes,
but as soon as you walk away from that, things revert back to normal. So a child gets this sense of they're no longer oppressed by their parents' power over them, and so they may act in a completely different way than they would otherwise.
Yes, definitely. It's no different than the ritualistic aspects of being in a ritual. Like when a ritual is being performed, you're going back to time immemorial and to whatever that ritual represents, and as long as you're within the confines of that ritual or that sacred space, it's safe to express yourself in that way. But once you're outside of that space, it's known that you can revert back to what's normal. At least I find that to be analogous.
I never considered that aspect of game playing, though. But that makes a lot of sense. That when you're in that universe or whatever it is, whether it's a board game, checkers, chess, whatever it is, that the rules of that game have a leveling effect between two people, or like a child and their parent.
Yeah.
Right, and that's why I brought up the three genres I did, because it's the same concept of agency, and that's why you see those genres as the predominant backgrounds. Even if there's like no story, it's just a board game kind of thing, where it can be a start to finish map. You still have that concept embedded somewhere in it that gives the sense of agency. So while the dice or whatever random effect is that kind of governs the randomness of that particular universe, you always come back to this concept of you still have a choice. You still get to have a say in some fashion. So there's always a way to do things, unless, of course, the rules say no.
You get control, right? I mean, it gives you control over something that somebody else is also participating in. So it does. I think it goes. Tell me if you think I'm wrong, but that goes way beyond just raw competition, right?
Oh, of course it does. In fact, another piece that I wrote, because it was in response to something that Monty Cook had asked a few years ago about, like, why are there so many arguments in games? And I wrote about the nature of the relationship between math and language, how they're basically doing the exact opposite. Like, numbers are so concrete, they have no meaning whatsoever. Because I can draw the symbol for the number 8, and I ask you to point at that object in reality, and you can't do it. There's just no way. It doesn't exist. But if I write the word cat or tree or whatever, which is a nebulous thing because the way I write it in one language isn't going to be the same in another, it totally changes everything. Because what cat? What kind of cat? I can point to anything that represents a cat, but I can't point to anything that represents an 8 other than another symbol for the number 8.
I've heard that called, oh boy, I'm going to murder this. I think I heard it called Aristotelian modeling, where you...
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, you that's pretty much it. But when it comes to the language, when it starts playing into it, I've kind of termed it a catachristic dichotomy, because we keep trying to reach for these things to make math and language work, which is the problem with games, because we're trying to make these two things work together and they don't, at least not in the way that we want them to. So we have to trick ourselves into believing that they're communicating with each other when it's actually us making them communicate. Which, to get back to your point about the whole issue of competition, that's what games are originally about. Because it's not so much about saying, okay, we're going to do this so that way we don't kill each other, because that is part of why people play games together. But it's also to find out who's the best at this task.
That's interesting. So who's the best at games of chance or games of skill or games of tactics or
strategies or...
Yeah, or like how to weave something, like tie a knot or do this, and whether it's in this amount of time or under these weird conditions and things like that. Because that's how we develop into specialized groups, and we can increase our chances of survival. And
we do it professionally every day. We model things in engineering. we run simulations. I mean, this is an integral part of any society. I think any advanced society has to have this ability to kind of simulate things or test them, or and then the competition often becomes the bragging piece. Okay, like especially like in the military. If you're in the military and your unit, your division, your whatever can run this, or you win this competition that where you're pretending to fight other armies and stuff. I mean, it's sort of baked in. And
you guys should divulge your military background. I forgot to mention that that Richard was in the military, and so is Matt. So I'm the only one who has not been, so I may not get those references, but you guys will.
Well, yeah, because for us, even though I was a tanker, we sometimes participated in MOUT training, which is more urban stuff than it is anything else. But sometimes tanks have to go through cities. But the majority of what we did used, which is basically a fancy version of laser tag. And so, you wear sensors and things like that, or your vehicles have sensor panels on them, so they can actually keep track of which vehicles were killed during the simulated exercise. And that was actually one of the ways that we figured out what unit was the best. But it's also what allowed us to keep our skills up.
Right. No, exactly. I was, and it was the same with us. It was uptime. I was a maintainer. I worked on aircraft. And we were always measured against that. We were constantly competing to be better, to be faster, more efficient, whatever it was. They always had that running in the background. So it was like we were always competing against ourselves too. So
and that's actually what you see in NASCAR with the pit crews.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they for turnaround, how fast they can pit a car, 4-tire change, full fuel, and back out of the pits. I mean, that's like a ridiculous. Yeah, and they I think they have competitions amongst the pit crews, for instance.
They do.
So it's not just about who won, with the cars going out making left turns. It's also about, the individual pit crews and stuff themselves have bragging rights.
Well, yeah, because if you ever watch a race, you'll see they have clocks running when the pit crew's there to see how fast they can pit and get back out on the track.
Yeah, absolutely. So you think
that's a game right there? It's a game within a game.
Yeah, exactly. It really is.
What's your take on metagaming, Richard?
I like it.
First,
up to a point.
Let's explain what metagaming is. Eric.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you wanted him or me. Okay, at least what I mean by it is the game outside of the game that might be played, for instance, amongst the players themselves, that influences things that happen in the game. Like, hey, man, if you give me that extra hot dog, I'll give you the next magic item I come across, sort of a thing.
Yeah, and up to a point, I don't mind that. I think it's perfectly reasonable to have that because we are still competing. We're talking about people, even if you're in a cooperative environment, they're still going to compete. So it's just the way things are.
So do you encourage or discourage that in your personal campaigns and games?
I try to walk a fine line. I don't want the players to share information that the characters shouldn't have. But if they're talking about divvying up stuff or how they should best solve a problem, I'm okay with that. Because the rules are supposed to simulate a reality that none of us have ever actually experienced.
Right.
So if you don't live in that world and those rules of physics don't work for you, how else are you supposed to know what it's like for those characters? You can't. So I encourage a little bit of it. But there are things that I'll say no, you can't do that, and that's mostly when it comes to characters that aren't supposed to be in the same room, or if you're trying to do rules lawyering, because unfortunately, and the main reason for that is because it starts slowing the game down.
Or what about bribes between players or player and DM? Like the proverbial, I'll give you this real item, like I said earlier, maybe a hot dog or whatever, but for something inside the game, for some favoritism inside the game.
Between players and the game master, no. because that's manipulating the world in a way that's just it's basically corrupting the story.
Wait a minute. Are you saying actually giving the game master a hot dog in exchange for something in the game? Is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yeah.
Shit, I never thought about bribing a GM. Holy shit, that happens? That happens.
It's actually a card in Munchkin because it's that common of a thing.
Oh, it's happened to me personally.
No wonder I suck so bad at role-playing games. I never even thought of doing that.
Well, I just made a blanket no metagaming outside of the game, nothing like that. I just did a whole blanketing thing because it was coming from a really good friend of mine, and and I felt bad for him. I really wanted to help him just because he's willing to give me shit. It made me feel bad. Like, God, he really wants to know what's going to happen, or he really wants to know this. And he's usually for secrets of the campaign that he was having a hard time sussing out on his own through the game.
You know what? I between the two of you, because I was a role-playing gamer as a teenager. And then when I was in the military, but I think like a lot of people got later in life, and I sort of just kind of gravitated away from it for whatever reason. I haven't done it in years, but I still find the subject and the art and everything about it extremely fascinating. But if you had to kind of mark where, that to me, like the 70s and the 80s were sort of the apex of that whole genre, and there's a lot of us middle-aged people that have been influenced by it for sure, but where do you think it's at today? And I'm asking you, Richard, first, and I would love to hear your opinion on it too, Eric.
Sure.
But where do you think the state of this type of genre of gaming is today with the advent of computers and all this kind of other stuff that influences that same space?
Especially under the philosophical things we just discussed.
It's ubiquitous. I mean, just think about it. It's everywhere. Because let's just go all the way back to the very beginning with levels. I mean, you go up a level or, the next level or get some experience points. That's everywhere now. I mean, casual games for computers, cell phones. It's in everyday expressions. You can hear it in commercials. Hell, I've heard it for traffic reports for a local news station, like 24/7 news. So it's everywhere. It's the basis of our modern entertainment. In fact, a good example is this. Okay, I take it you're familiar with the film War Games, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. What about Tron?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Both those films, the nerd has no power. Has no agency to affect any change whatsoever. And to show that, Jeff Bridges is supposed to be the star of Tron. The story is his story. It's about him trying to get his company back and getting sucked into a computer, right?
Right.
But once he's in there, who's the action? Who's the focus?
It's on that other guy, isn't it? What's his name?
It's on Tron.
Tron, yeah, but I was trying to remember his actor name. I can't remember what it is. But yeah, it's on Tron.
It's Bruce Boxleitner.
Yeah.
And the focus is on it's on Tron. It's on the character who's the warrior, right? And in War Games, what you have is Matthew Broderick's character is a hacker who somehow manages to get into a DoD computer and launch a simulation, yada, yada, yada. And then the military gets involved. And no matter what he tries to do to stop the computer from launching the missiles, he's thwarted at every turn by the military structure. So both of these characters, who are supposed to be the focal characters, are completely behind the scenes for the most part. I mean, they move the story forward, but they have no agency. It's basically they're going along with what happens to them.
Yeah, it's
until
interesting.
the end. And then they get to make the big decision when all else fails. And those are the movies that influence modern filmmakers, because look at Tron Legacy. The actor who plays Flynn's son is the focal character the entire time. He starts off as a badass who's riding a motorcycle, who base jumps off of a tower, in the middle of the town, and gets away from basically gets away from the cops. And that's before he goes into the computer.
They did that with Star Trek. When they relaunched Star Trek with Captain Kirk in the beginning, running from the cops, and he's like a real badass. You know.
Yeah.
Of course,
Yeah, he goes, and then the '60s version before they did the timeline change, you know, the original series, he's still action oriented, but he's more thoughtful.
right.
Yeah.
He has a moral center to him that he relies on before he does anything.
He's a strong leader,
Right, so-
not just an adventurer.
Right. I mean, he does adventurous things because, you know, this is still the '60s, so the leading man has to be, you know, gung-ho and whatnot. But he still has this core about him of, you know, using this moral center. But he's not like these other characters who are supposed to be the center of the story, but aren't being, you know, characters with agency until you get to the modern era, where now you have stories that are told because of role-playing games, because these writers and directors grew up playing them. They're now in charge, and so the characters are reflecting the reality that they want to showcase, which is
yeah.
Such as in Stranger Things.
I was just going to say that Stranger Things is a prime example of that, isn't it?
and also 8mm by J.J. Abrams. The same thing happens, even though it's or not 8mm, sorry, Super 8.
Okay.
It's all from the kid's point of view.
Huh. That's interesting. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's been this leap in the last, 20, 30 years where we basically went from the nerd was nobody to the nerd is the hero.
Yeah.
I mean, all you have to do is look at Ready Player One.
Yep.
Yep.
Oh, what's the number one sitcom on television right now is The Big Bang Theory.
Right.
Yep.
And there's a reason for this, and it has to do with how ubiquitous role-playing games have become in our society. Not necessarily that everybody plays them, but just how influential they are in everything from computer programming to the way the internet looks. I know that's baffling for some people, but there's actually real evidence for that as well.
Yeah,
So
if you want to
it's everywhere.
talk about that some too, I would be interested in hearing that. I know it's a bit of a segue about what we're talking about, but it's interesting.
Yeah, well, it kind of plays into some of the stuff I said earlier about, H.G. Wells, because H.G. Wells actually talked about building something called the World Brain, which was an encyclopedia anybody could go to, an electronic, database, basically, where people could get the information that they requested. That's Wikipedia. Julian Dibble, the guy that created Colossal Cave Adventure, he's also the guy that created the first multiplex router that essentially helped create the backbone of the internet to allow multiple computers to talk to each other and send packets to different systems at the same time.
TPC?
He was influenced by Dungeons and Dragons. It helped him develop the technology, because the technology that is embedded in role-playing games and the format of them is the same technology used in procedural programming.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's funny because I am a programmer. I mean, in my professional life now, I program machines. Scary.
Yeah, and so
I've replaced more jobs than any Mexican in the history of the United States. Personally.
When computer programming first started, everything had line numbers. You had to include a line number, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Nowadays, you don't need the line number. It's already assumed. And the number one thing that computer languages do is they use object-oriented programming,
Yep.
meaning that the object, which is a self-contained subroutine, contains all the instructions that it needs to do whatever it is that it's supposed to do. Character classes are objects.
Yep.
So role-playing games are object-oriented programming before object-oriented programming was a thing.
It's true. I never thought about that. I never thought about it like that, but you're absolutely right. And I tell you, the way that you have to structure your character sheets, the way you track everything. That all becomes like your inventory is like a subroutine.
Right, or
the way everything
it's
is
information.
separated, and you're right. Yeah, the way you what is it? I guess you codify everything.
Right, and so because I work in a library, we refer to it as controlled vocabulary, which is a form of information literacy. By structuring the information around keywords and certain concepts, I can reduce the number of terms that I need to a manageable level to help get to the point faster.
Wow.
Right.
But it's figuring out how many terms and how much information is stuffed into those terms. That's the key. Because I can build a database around anything, but if that database isn't usable by a computer or, more importantly, by a person, I did absolutely nothing for no reason.
Language is a big part of this equation too, because the more robust your language, right, the more information that can be stored in that language, or the more commands that can be executed. So, I mean, you know what I'm saying? So, I heard it said one time that how was it put? It was in a book called Science and Sanity by this guy named Alfred Grzybyski. It's just like this kind of esoteric textbook you can still find today. But he said something to the effect of the entirety of any society's knowledge is contained within its language, and that the societies that have the most words tend to also be the most advanced societies. And the societies that have the least words tend to be the most regressive societies. And I don't think I've ever found an exception to that, to this day. Like, I've never been able to think of a single exception to that rule.
As I am working at a library at Ohio University, much like Richard, I think that's great. I think that's fine.
Well, it actually plays into the term of catachresis, which was Plato was talking about this. Because when we come up against a concept that we don't know, we have to either make up a new word or put that into some other word that already exists. Like, otherwise, how do we describe something we've experienced that no one has ever experienced before?
Sure, yeah. So, I have to ask you, and because, we have to talk about these aspects since we're talking about...
We didn't get your opinion on the state of modern gaming, modern role-playing games. So, right, to sum Richard up, it sounds like you're saying that it's just sort of, it's not only is it there, it's in everything now, because it's permeated those people who've brought it into the rest of the world just kind of by proxy, yeah?
Yeah, in a lot of ways. I mean, there's certain things that you can point to where that's not quite true, but it's, for the large part, that's pretty accurate.
And you kind of agree with that, Eric? You think
I agree with everything he said, and the only other things that I might point out is that not only are they ubiquitous, but there is even small movements for particular styles and particular rules to come back into play. It's even variated to the point where there's all these different kinds of play. You can be somebody who plays Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and combine first, second, and third edition rules, and then there's people who are playing Advanced Dungeons & Dragons who will specifically and only play by the book out of one edition. There's all these people who have made their own little groups and are participating in this ubiquitous.
So you're saying there's like subcultures now within the culture, which used to be just a
Well, it used to be a local movement more than likely that's found some way of congealing because of the multimedia platform that we're allowed to congregate in. All these people who are doing things specifically, who in their local area might be isolated or something like that. But when they get on the web, they find like-minded people. So now you have these groups where like-minded people, like for instance on Facebook, there is a group for people to discuss and post about specifically and only first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons game.
And
Nothing else is
you know,
welcome.
I actually was thinking about, you know, when you were talking about that, that's probably single-handedly the most salient point that could be made about what happened to TSR, because that was right about the time when
The new
when
TSR
the market,
or the old TSR?
the old TSR, when they fractured the market with so many different game settings.
Oh, right.
Because that was because the bulletin board, you know, this pre World Wide Web stuff. So for some of you who don't know what that is, that's what I think actually broke the community from a single monolithic kind of thing. Because once people realized that they could play not only online or by mail and stuff like that, they could play in a specific world that resonated with them more so than any other. So you have the fan groups developing well before social media arose.
So,
but it's fractured even more since then.
Gosh, this is like a fascinating conversation. I've got two things that I still am trying to remember to ask you, and this kind of leads to one of them. Have you read? It's Kuntz's book. His new.
No, I haven't. I've heard about it, but I haven't had a chance to.
Okay, so you know, I read it, and this is my take on it. Obviously, I don't speak for him or anything, but this is what it appeared to say to me, okay? First of all, I want to point out that the wording that was used in writing the book, the words were like huge words, like complicated words. And I'm a pretty good reader and have a pretty good vocabulary, and some of those words were like, wow, man, I can't believe that. So my point is it was a bit of a difficult read, but from what I could understand is that Kuntz took umbrage with Gygax for taking Arneson's idea and codifying it down to a set of rules that could be slightly changed to different flavors like fantasy, science fiction, post-apocalyptic, and sold in a company format.
Okay, you're going in the weeds here with this Kuntz guy, though. Who is this person in relation? Yeah.
What's his first name?
He's one of the original staff members for TSR.
Yeah.
And TSR is the company that first released Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, Dungeons and Dragons, the tabletop game, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, this was we're talking about like late 70s, early 80s time frame.
Okay.
And his first name's Robert, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I want to make sure because he had a brother and that was Terry. But so Robert Kuntz, yes, he also co-wrote the Deities and Demigods book that was first edition, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and I think he also had a hand in writing the predecessor of that book from Dungeons and Dragons. It's a similar name, but it escapes me exactly what it is. But at any rate...
So this guy took exception with something that Gary Gygax, the original creator of Dungeons and Dragons...
Yeah, the way the book kind of lays it out is that Arneson had this idea that was a fractal idea, that any part of the idea could be extrapolated indefinitely, and that it was a paradigm shift in how game theory had developed, that prior to this... From the Stone Age prior to this, that gaming theory had pretty much been a competitive one or more players versus one or more players kind of a situation, and had definite beginnings and definite endings. But that he made this paradigm shift, Dave Arneson made this paradigm shift in having this concept of putting this role-playing aspect and mechanics on top of games. And that... that there, if you didn't put any boundaries to it, essentially, if you didn't write any rules to it, that you could do anything with it, and that it was given that way to everybody, that he wanted to give that to every player and every person, right? And that, from what I understand, that Gygax came in and took that idea and codified it, like basically rounded the freedom of that idea up and caged it, and used it for his own ends, which was to fit that idea strongly through the template of fantasy and make money off of it.
Make publishable material.
Yeah, that seemed to be how I read it, unless I grossly mistook what I read, you know.
And your opinion is you think that, are you saying that you agree with?
My opinion, as I've stated elsewhere, even in public, is that it's much to do about nothing, right? It's not like by doing that Gygax did anything with that idea. That idea is still out there to be used in whatever way people want to use it. And
yeah, it actually has been done.
Right, yeah. I mean, I just don't see what all the brouhaha is about personally. And from what I understand from other people who have taken a look at it, they don't really understand it either. They feel, from what I understand, that he's kicking a dead horse.
Hey, Richard, given, and I don't want to take us down a rat hole here or whatever, a wormhole, but obviously given that you've got published material, right? Have you suffered the wrath of social media and or the benefits of it because you're writing stuff, right? I mean, you're putting stuff out there. I mean, how does that land now in the world of social media and things like that?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of reviews for Cosmos Builder. One of them just pans the hell out of the book, and I can understand that from a certain point of view, because it's kind of like with what was just being discussed here. Because think about it in the terms of game design, in terms of principles. If you have a fractal, how do you use that? Because like Eric was talking about, right? I mean, if you have something like this where you're sitting there and you can turn it however you want to fit the setting, to reflect the flavor of whatever you need to without having to like codify it, it gives you this wonderful thing, right? But at the same time, you're trying to pack so much detail into that fractal that people have to try to extract that to figure out what it is that they're looking at. And I kind of had to do something similar, no, not to that extent, with the Cosmos Builder book. It's like, how do you tell somebody how to build an infinite series of infinities in 128 pages? I mean, you have to use really large technical words. It's the only way to pull it off.
Well, there has to become a part of this, right, where it's left into the hands of the people playing the game and or the person running it, right? I mean, because otherwise 128 pages doesn't even begin to skim the surface of what would be necessary to create an entire world.
Exactly. So I had to try to pack in as much detail as I could in such a small space that you can't really do a fractal. I mean, I tried, but it's not very successful. And so for some people, that's just like that. It just blows their mind, because it's like, how do you conceive of this? It's like, how does this work? And for other people, they thought it was great. So I got a 1-star review and then a 5-star review.
Welcome to the internet.
And let me say let me say here that this is how I came into contact with Richard, was that I had purchased his book and I read it, and I got in contact with him because of that. And from my outside perspective, when I read it, I thought it was brilliant. I thought that the terminology that you used was appropriate and stylistically appropriate, as well as being appropriate to definition of what the subject matter was. And not only that, but in my case, it didn't stop me in any way from utilizing the information in that book to create with it exactly what that book was meant to allow you to create.
Well, we have the author here, so right. So, Richard, take some time and tell us what is Cosmos. I mean, if give me your elevator, and don't give me your elevator pitch. Give me a better than that, right? Tell me, what is this world you've created here?
So, Cosmos Builder was essentially a building block system to create anything you wanted to represent the homes of the gods. So any kind of plane of existence that you could conceive of, there was a tool in the book to help you do that.
Interesting.
And so there were some random charts in there, not a whole lot, but there was enough random charts to get you started so you could understand how it works. Some of it was taken from quantum mechanics. So it's like you don't have to limit yourself to just 3 dimensions. The way that I set it up, you could have multiple dimensions. And rather than just being space, width, and height, height, width, and depth, or space and time, it was more along the lines of metaphysical: good, evil, law, chaos, probability, vitality, energy, all sorts of things like that. I mean, anything you could do, you could practically find something in the book to help you do that. So I kind of was taking it from the approach of, at some point, somebody's going to do like a shotgun or a spaghetti test. You throw it out the wall and see what sticks. And that was pretty much the way that I approached the material, because I was like, oh my God, how do I do a million things? And, because I was literally limited to 400 manuscript pages, and I overwrote the book because I had no idea that when I was told 400 pages, that meant double spaced.
Yeah, and I was lucky enough to get your unpublished manuscript of the first Castle Builder.
Yeah, and that uses the same approach. I like to use the concept of a building block to do things, whether it's a RPG or if it's a supplement for one, because that's how computer programs work. And I want people to feel like they're able to make whatever it is that they need without having me say, no, you can't do that. Because I'm not there. I don't know what story you're going to tell. So the best approach for my money is to let you do whatever you want.
And
it's your world. And
I consider that manuscript to be the pure form, because it was kind of written with Dangerous Journeys and Mythos in mind. And am I right?
Yeah, so it was supposed to basically cater to OGL, Dangerous Journeys, and Legendary Adventures all at the same time.
And that's why I love it. That's why I love that version of it. And I did end up with the you ended up doing another version of Castle Builder, right? And now you're redoing that again. Am I right?
Yeah, and so the new version, unfortunately, I haven't worked on it in a little over a year because of different things that happen with like moving to different locations and not having the table space to use a mouse properly because I have carpal tunnel. So I haven't finished them all, but the chapters are written. It's just the mapping that's been a pain. But other than that, I've restored the original costs. So like to allow players to once again use it for different game systems. So it's not just rated in gold pieces; it's also rated in dollar amounts that other game systems also use.
Nice. That's going to be nice. Now that was one thing I wanted to talk about philosophy about Kuntz and what he was saying, and I'm in no way trying.
It's funny. I hate to interrupt you, but it just while you guys were talking, it sort of hit me. That this genre is big enough now that it has a tell-all book. Okay, right? It is matured to the point where someone is, air quotes, spilling the beans or whatever.
I think they've already had some of those, haven't they?
Oh, yeah, there's several. There's also Playing at the World.
Yeah, documentaries.
Of Dice and Men.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. I didn't realize that, but I was like, holy crap.
Yeah, and then Empire of Imagination, which, depending on who you ask, is either okay or terrible because it's actually inserting thoughts into Gary's head.
Huh, I've not seen that yet. I've read... wait a minute. No, I have. I've read Empire of the Imagination, and I'm about halfway through Playing at the World. I love Playing at the World. It's very academic, and it's easy for other things to kind of sway you away from it. But, I mean, so far, it's pretty much been the source of gaming history that I've seen collected under two covers.
And then there's also... he has a website for that, and then Shannon Appelkline did Dungeons and Designers series for Evil Hat.
I got those
chronicles the first 40 years of gaming.
Yep. I got them. I got the first version of that when that was all together before they started being sold in separate volumes.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I do have that, and that's like a companion piece to go right along with playing with the world, you know.
Well, you got this genre has its own convention.
A lot of them.
Well, gaming has grown to the point where it's everywhere. I mean, there's conventions for everything. I didn't realize this, but here in Northern California, what's it called? There's KublaCon and one, I think it's called DundraCon or something like that. I can't remember, but it's located in
DundraCon.
It's been going on. Yeah, it's been going on for like 40 years now.
Yeah, they're all over the place, man. The Origins is right in my back door. It's Columbus, Ohio, which is about 45 miles north of where I'm at right now. And that's every year Origins. And they are the oldest or second oldest. I think they're the oldest, aren't they?
Yeah. I think they're the oldest because they're actually then also Gamma, which is like they have a trade show.
Yeah. So here's the other thing I was wanting to ask you in terms of the philosophical nature of gaming and storytelling. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, and I'm going to assume that you haven't had time to do this yet, but did you have a chance to check out my thesis?
No.
Okay, that's good though.
Mainly because there's a lot of stuff going on.
Well, right. That's good because that way I'm not rehashing anything now. But I just wanted to ask your opinion about a couple of the points that I brought up in that. And essentially the thesis was on first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and Satanism, basically the Satanic Panic.
Oh, we did a whole podcast on that. We did a podcast on that, I don't know, a couple months ago.
Yeah.
On that, that's right.
Yeah, if you really want to hear the podcast, there's an associated podcast.
It was fascinating. I didn't realize it, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, there's the 2 points. The main 2 points to the thesis was that the Christian right and the political right both had legitimate concerns when they had issues with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. The political right had issues with it because they were a hegemony that were trying to pass their values down, culturally speaking, to the citizens in the next generation. And the role-playing game aspect of Dungeons and Dragons allowed for a Plutonic mind model. And I talk about how important these things are, how like when you read Plato and stuff, there's a lot of talk about mind models where they talk about, who would be the best person to rule or govern a city, and they go through like these simulations, these mind simulations, until they arrive at what they think is best. And of course, I point out that Einstein did this same thing when he came up with the theory of relativity. He was having a mind model of what would happen of a person falling in an elevator or riding beside a ray of light. So in that sense, this game provides this complex, made-to-be drawn-out mind model that people can try out things in. They can try out different governments and different sexes and different ways of doing things, and they can see this played out before them and as time goes by playing the game. Like, not only is it a mind model, but it gives you the ability to simulate these things and see them to their conclusion, right? So it interferes with that hegemony passing down those cultural and political values. And then in the same way, the Christian right, because there was no denying that there was an appeal to this game and this phenomenon, and that it was satisfying the same parts of the brain that happens when you go to church, that the game was acting as a metaphysical bridge to another world, just like, for instance, the Bible would give you a set of rules, and you would use these set of rules to describe a place that didn't exist where you were now, but that you all agreed existed to. and that it fulfilled these same purposes. I'm really skimming it right now. You'd have to like check it out and read it, but just the concept that it allows you this ability to have this realm that you can play in and try things out in, very esoterical things that you couldn't just mechanically put together and try out.
Yeah, because no one's going to create a religion and then get a bunch of people go, hey, let's test this and see what happens.
Right, but you could in D&D.
But you could in D&D, right.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, okay, this actually plays into mythic cycles as well. This has all happened before, and it'll probably happen again.
Yeah.
The difference is, instead of the focus being on Dungeons and Dragons, which, like I refer to the piece that I wrote called Kitchen Table Theater, happened with theater after the collapse of the Roman Empire, because the Ludus Romani, right, when that ended, after Christianity took over and the empire fell apart, the church banned plays, outright banned drama.
Wow.
For hundreds of years.
For the same reason, presumably.
Exactly, for the same exact reason that the Satanic Panic was driven by, and that was that the focus on the plays at the time, because they were most plays were, even though not all of them were, most plays had some kind of mythic component. So they were dealing with either the mythology of Roman society, or had characters in stories that called upon the various deities. Not always, but like I said, that was a common thing. I mean, look at Lysistrata from Greek theater. It's one of those plays that, as a comedy, it's one of the bawdiest comedies imaginable when you think about what it is. It's basically this woman, Lysistrata, organizing the women of the town, saying that they will not have sex with their husbands until they call off the war.
Right.
Yeah, it was remade. They just made a movie about Chicago, right?
Right, and it also happened in real life. Right. There's a country where this actually happened. The women did this, so it does exist in reality. And like Colbert, when he was still in the Colbert Report, actually had the lady on who was behind. I can't remember if it was the film or the actual woman who organized it, but he started laughing and said, "That's Lysistrata." So.
Because it happened, yeah, you're right. It actually happened in an inner city, right? It was something about to try to stop gang violence or something like that, wasn't it?
And also to stop a civil war in Africa.
Okay.
It's actually happened. So I mean, these things do take place, but the problem was with the church. They didn't want the focus to be on any mythical elements that conflicted with the message they wanted to send. So all theater was considered heretical.
Yeah,
but
right.
Then something happened somewhere around 900 to 1000 CE. You have the liturgical performances coming back into the church. So in addition to ritual, which is what a lot of the plays were in terms of their mythical use, the church started using them to tell the messages from biblical texts.
Yeah, this was a part of the Reformation.
Right. So the church actually brought back theater, but for the longest time it was stuck in the church. And it wasn't until around the Reformation that it came out of the church and began to take the form that we know of today with stage plays.
Yeah, I just wrote a paper actually on that, on the beginnings of plays coming back into the Catholic Church and why they came back in and that sort of thing in the Reformation.
Yeah, and so you had this restoration of art in the Western world that came through this particular act on the church, because that's when you started seeing more iconography being created, the stained glass windows and the change of the architecture to the more familiar Baroque. That didn't come till later, but I mean that sort of march towards that ultimate expression of church art that we got in that time period. Before the modern era. I mean, the modern world that we know today.
Well,
so it's one of those interesting things. But like I said, it happened once. It was bound to happen again.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, like, this was, instead of being the theater of the body, it was the theater of the mind that became the target.
Oh, no, I know. I traced it from the cult panic to the satanic panic, and then to the super predator panic.
Yeah, it just keeps evolving. It's fear is what it is, but it just keeps putting on a new mask.
Yeah.
And the greatest fear is what happens when people have agency to make choices on their own.
So, Richard, I was wondering, considering all of the game philosophy and story philosophy and structure things that we've been discussing, when you design a product for a game or design a game, whether that's a role-playing game or a card game or a tabletop game, what do you consider to be like the most important rules or observations that you need to follow to make a game design that's going to be appealing to most people or achieve a specific end?
Well, first you need clarity. So as long as the rules make sense, that's a good start. It has to be something that people will want to play more than once. Otherwise, there's no point in designing something that can't be repeated. Unless you're trying to do like an art piece, like legacy games or something like Time Stories. Mm-hmm. Those are one-shot deals. I mean, it's great up to a point, but there's no replayability. So for me, what I try to achieve is this fun, not just for me, but is this something that other people will find fun? All right? And so that's where the playtesting comes into view, because I want to make sure that other people enjoy it without me having to explain it to them. If they could do that, then I know that I did what I needed to do.
Gotcha. Like a user-friendly game that is not giving much resistance between the participants and the fun being had.
Yeah, so I want to have the fewest number of barriers possible. I know I can't please everybody. I'm not going to try to. That's just ridiculous. But at the same time, I want to make sure that I can maximize the audience, so that way people can invite their friends over, or their family, to play a game that they're going to find enjoyable, because it's something that will be appealing to just about anybody, because they can find something that reflects some aspect of them in the way the game works.
Right on. Now, if you're doing a game that's very specific, like you were talking about, and you said you called them legacy games, is that right?
Yeah,
or art games?
Legacy games are like Risk Legacy, Pandemic Legacy, all of those kinds of games.
So if you're doing something really specific or trying to appeal to only a certain kind of gamer, what philosophies would you observe?
I would make sure that I'm fulfilling all the criteria for that particular audience. So if I wanted to play a legacy game, I would make sure that the campaign was something that was not only sustainable, but like really, really drove home the point of whatever the setting is.
Was relevant.
So that's
to
one
the
of the
setting.
great.
Sorry,
that's one of the great things about Pandemic Legacy, is that if you screw up and the plague wipes out one of the cities, that city is gone permanently. You basically lost an entire metropolitan area somewhere in the world in something like that. So from a storytelling perspective, it's an interesting concept. So that's the main thing that I like about them, is how you can tell a story. using that model.
Yeah, that was one thing that always, vexed at me a bit about playing role-playing games that were set in worlds. As an example, a module set in the world of Greyhawk. A lot of those modules, when you would read them, they would the big words would tell you how this was going to be a dramatic campaign-affecting story, and you really wanted to buy this module, right? But generally written near the end of the module somewhere was some mechanism that kind of put everything back in balance again at the end.
And a module is...
I mean, just any module.
No, but what is a module?
Oh, a module is generally a story, an adventure setting that's generally in a specific world. So it's like, I don't know, Richard, would you maybe do a better example? I seem to be floundering on that question.
It's basically a one-shot adventure. It's like a complete story arc in and of itself. So, and like Eric was saying, usually they're set in a specific location. There were, at one point for AD&D, more so than any of the other versions of Dungeons & Dragons, modules that were universal. But as the worlds became more codified, there were less attempts to create modules that would fit anywhere. In fact, rather than having the modules that would fit anywhere, it turned more into the style of we're going to make these generic adventures and publish them in our magazine. So if you want to have something that can fit anywhere, go buy those. And
it always seemed like a lot of those promised these earth-shaking changes in your campaign, but always ended with something happening that prevented anybody from doing it. Like I think I don't know. Gosh, I know I've had examples of this, and I can't think of any.
Oh, I know one perfectly.
Go ahead, please do.
Faction War for Planescape.
I haven't read it, but
the way that it was set up, by the end of the module, spoiler alert for anybody who missed it almost 15, 20 years ago, the end scenario was that the factions were banished or had to reform from the city of Sigil. The Lady of Pain basically, once you've stopped everything, gives you a chance to make a permanent change to the setting, or at least to the city of Sigil, which, since it's the key to the multiverse in terms of being the main metropolitan area, whatever you did would have a huge impact. But nothing else came after it. It was essentially the last supplement ever produced, but it was done in such a way that you could theoretically, using a one-word wish power, restore everything to the way it was before the adventure even started.
Right, and I get that because they want to keep a little bit of balance in their game setting because they plan on publishing future things, and that's dependent on not there being a lot of changes in it. So, so that's what a lot of them end up being that way. So it's really weird. It's a bit contrived when you play them. But I mean, I suppose the other alternative is to have a game world that varies drastically from what the quote unquote official game world is.
And the only other thing that was done, has been done mainly by Wizards of the Coast and TSR for Dungeons and Dragons games, was the RPGA adventures for living campaigns.
Oh yeah, right, real specific.
And they were somewhat episodic, and you had incremental changes, but they were so small as to be negligible for anybody who didn't participate in the living campaign.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's supposed to be high adventure, high fantasy, but in situations of that particular nature, you end up feeling a bit watered down in the end. I mean, even if you're getting the fulfillment of what it is that you're trying to reflect in the game with your persona, you may still come away from that feeling that your victory has been a bit watered down.
Why? I mean, it's just a rule set, right?
Well, yeah, but they're trying to maintain a certain status quo, so there's a level to how much change that the official company that produces the world is willing to accept. So say you, for instance, in the World of Greyhawk setting, if you was to go and wipe out Divers completely and destroy it, they wouldn't do that. They would still have that city there, and perhaps if they wrote a module in the future, that module might take place in that city, which in your world it was destroyed a long time ago, right? So if they make an official module, they're not going to do something that's going to destroy a whole city like that or some big change unless that's the whole point of those modules, and those modules are acting as transitionary stories into a new phase of development that the company has sanctified.
No, I get
and
it.
on top of that,
Go ahead.
one of the things that happened was that if enough players completed a living world adventure in a specific way, that was what happened officially. So if your group didn't do it the same way and something drastically different happened, it was wiped out.
That's interesting.
So you're saying that because of the way they tried to sculpt these worlds, they sort of took some of the playability out of it. You kind of have to follow their story arc. Or if you don't follow their story arc, you're not going to be able to buy supplemental material.
No, you could still buy the material, but what happened was that you lost some of your agency.
I probably should have been more clear, but that's kind of what I was getting at. Their supplemental material would become less relevant.
Yeah.
And harder to play because you would have to try to omit stuff or whatever that doesn't exist in your version of that world.
And of course,
So it does. Where does it come to the point where it's like, well, shit, just come run the game for me then? What am I even doing this for?
Well, I mean, yeah, this cuts to the matter of what Kuntz was talking about, right? He was talking about how stringently, I believe, people are intended or coerced into following the company's official version of a game setting's timeline, right?
And what, he felt that sort of violated the spirit of what this was about?
About what the spirit of what Dave Arneson had come up with. He felt that Dave Arneson had come up with something that shouldn't be shackled in those terms or give people the impression that there was a box around them like that by saying that things were official and coming from a company. I mean, the other side of that story is that the reason why things were official and not official was because at the time there were people that were writing supplements and games based on
the rules.
TSR's property,
Right.
So they kind of had to distinguish it from other things. But then another side to that coin is that if they were going to plan big changes for their world, then they needed to not have any change that was going to occur that would block their plans.
Let me ask you both this question then, Richard. You first, okay? Isn't this the natural evolution of something like this where you have a company now that has to create revenue? So it has to find a methodology with which to do that. And I mean, other than creating supplemental material, which would necessarily have to follow a story arc, right? Unless I'm wrong, there's no other way to do it. So they had to compete with the people that, like you said, that were already writing supplemental material based on their rules or based on their original, their source material. So they had to compete. They didn't really kind of have a choice,
until
right?
Peter Atkinson came along and used Linux code, an open source code, to model the open source gaming license. And then they decided to pretty much, I think, sell off all of their gaming worlds that they had accumulated and focus just on rules. And kind of made the situation where anybody could write a module or a setting within their rules as long as they were using their rules. And that led to a flooding of the market.
If you look at what happened, though, before the open gaming license and all that came about, to answer your question about revenue streams and that, they did. They had, and that's where the novels come in more than anything else. The novels reflected changes that happened, but they weren't necessarily in the rules.
Yeah.
So you could read the novels and experience the world, and none of that would actually matter to your setting if you didn't want it to. It didn't matter if your players were reading the books. You could just say that that didn't happen yet, or it's not going to happen. But it gave them it gave them a sense of how the world works. And then on top of that, like there's the way Paizo does it with Pathfinder. You have a core book for the Inner Sea World, Player's Guide or the Inner Sea World Guide that gives you a breakdown of all the countries and everything else for that setting. But then instead of having supplements that you have to buy, they did it as adventure paths. So they have adventures that they publish that tell specific stories, and you can play those. But those don't necessarily change the world from the core book, so you can play whatever you want and not be tied down to whatever the modules have been written to do. So they basically try to solve the problem that you were referring to by tackling it from two different angles, the fiction line and the adventure line. So that way, when they did release supplements for the campaign worlds, they could release supplements that either focused on nations, special rules that in that world, or that actually reflected some of the novels. So that way you could play the events in the books.
That's interesting. And I was thinking earlier when you were talking about TSR's books and stuff, that was also a way in which if players read the books and see how that went, that they could get satisfaction and resolution and trying it in a different way and seeing if they had a better outcome too.
And the main reason for the novels was actually to try to draw people to those worlds.
Yeah, and they did a really good job. They were I mean, a lot of people I knew in high school was reading these things, all the Forgotten Realm and Dragonlance novels and to some extent Greyhawk novels. A lot of people were reading those.
I read the Mystara novels when I was in high school, but I mean, even though that's one of my favorite, like, generic fantasy worlds from Dungeons and Dragons, I have to admit the best novels that I've read so far have been the original Dragonlance trilogy.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, they're good.
I agree with that.
They're excellent.
If you were never into gaming, it wouldn't matter. They're fantastic. I can't believe that's never been made into a trilogy of movies like they did with especially with the special effects that's
Shannara
available
Chronicles.
today. Yeah, it'd be amazing to put that out as a movie or some sort of animation even, but
they did an animation. Don't look for it.
yeah, it's bad.
Instead,
I watched it.
Instead, look up Incubus because it stars William Shatner and everybody speaks Esperanto.
I mean, because it would have been the part of the problem is the animation, and then they made some changes that hinted at there would have been further developments. But it wasn't that good. The only thing that I really liked about it was Kiefer Sutherland as Raceland.
Good. The right voice actor kind of thing, huh?
Pretty much. That was probably the highlight for me.
So it does seem like, though, some of these decisions were made by these companies strictly. It sounds like they were financial decisions.
Yeah.
They weren't necessarily artistic or creative decisions. There were ways to try to continue to keep revenue. Because I remember there was a Dragon magazine, there was books, I always found the novels, though, to be really disconnected from the gameplay. That was on purpose. Is that right?
Yeah, because if for instance with the Dragonlance books. Okay, so Dragonlance was Tracy Hickman's setting, my understanding, before it became a world for D&D. But these were things that were monetized because they found that they could use them as ways to give people, something they could hold on to, like something they could grasp. So near the end of TSR's run, they put out a list of all the campaigns and what type of campaign it was. So Dragonlance was considered romance. Dark Sun is like your post-apocalyptic setting. I mean, it's literally set after the mages of the world have pretty much destroyed it. Spelljammer is D&D in space. I mean, it literally on the box for Spelljammer, it said AD&D in space.
Yep.
Birthright was a campaign that allowed you to play as kingdoms.
Yeah.
So, like, you got so before Game of Thrones existed, you had Birthright, which was pretty much the same thing, where you're playing these games of politics with different houses vying for control, and they got X number of turns per year to do certain political maneuvers, and then the rest of the time you played a character in that world. So I mean, there were attempts to try to eke out settings that played up on one or more elements that people have taken for granted as part of fantasy in some capacity. But the problem is you can't really monetize those things beyond a certain point, because after you've developed the world, if you're not developing it further through stories, because it might mess with the player's ability to tell the stories they want using the worlds you created for them, you have a problem. And it's not an easy solution. You have to try to figure out how best do you work around this, since you unfortunately paint yourself into a corner. It's the nature of the beast. It's the way all games work. It doesn't matter if it's a role-playing game or a board game. Once you reach a point of saturation where you've learned everything you need to learn about the game, it's what I call the driven towards extinction. I actually wrote an essay about it. That's literally what games do. Games are designed to drive themselves into extinction once you've learned the rules. And so what you do is you go find something else that gives you the same challenge that you experienced when you first started playing the other game.
Yeah, I've had that experience before.
But that's what happens though when a game is or a story is run its course and you can't tell any more stories, because this goes. I can use the example of Last Jedi again. It's a cyclic myth. All the trilogies use the same story format because they're part of a cycle that gets repeated infinitely for that mythic structure. The problem that people have with it is it's repeating the same mythic story, even though there's been changes.
Yeah.
Because once you've seen this thing too many times, if you don't appreciate the art that goes into telling the same story but different, in walking that fine line to make sure that the plot is the same, it doesn't play well for that audience, because they don't understand why they're being told the same story repeatedly with the same characters.
Yep. With the same archetypes, with everything. It's just all this, yeah.
And so that's where you run into the problem of revenue streams, and where you either have to just invent new worlds or create a new system, so that way you can sweep away all the detritus that's developed over the years from that system and all the bugs that people found that you couldn't explain away, and reinvent the wheel and try to recreate a new world that still fulfills those needs, but doesn't have all the baggage that comes with it.
Now, when you talk about doing that, are you talking about having the same story being told just with a different world setting background, or are you talking about how, like, when I first met you, you had kind of a chart that laid out all of the possible types of stories? And switching to one of those.
And it's actually both, because it's not just the story itself, it's also the system that tells the story.
Okay. So I'm assuming then that these are universal truths and knowledge that people understand, people in the business of making movies like this, or am I wrong in saying that? And would you say that this kind of knowledge is something that most people don't consider, understand, or know, and that that's also another reason why you're seeing a recapitulation in these cycles? I mean, like you pointed out, to appreciate them as a long-term audience, you have to appreciate the subtle differences specifically in the art of that, and if you can't, is it known by the people writing these things today that they're being so repetitive and that perhaps it's time to switch a story, or perhaps they don't know how to do that?
Well, you get a mix of that, because if you've seen the new Battlestar Galactica, the line that comes up the most time and again, which harkens back to the Iliad, is this has all happened before and it will all happen again. Just like I used that as an example with what happened with the the liturgical, plays that were brought back into the church and the Satanic Panic.
Right.
Right. So all this is it's a part of the cyclical nature of human behavior. So you can't escape these things because these stories are so timeless. They have to be told and retold time and again because each generation has to relearn the lesson. It's not like I could take my brain and put it in the body of a child and they would have all of my knowledge and in addition to their own personality. Since it doesn't work that way, they have to relearn or they have to learn all the crap that we've learned in order to not only function in society and be productive members of it, but also to understand what changes have been made and why certain models of the mythic cycle don't work for them.
And I imagine that not only do they have to go through the same trials and stuff, but they have to go through all the same processes of learning these things, right?
Yeah, and the trial for that is essentially the same for each individual. It's just the circumstances may be different, whether it's a generational thing or place of birth, the societal issues, whatever it has to be. There are certain things that are universal, and that's what most storytellers try to pull out of these mythic cycles and keep in place while trying to tell a slightly different story. But it's all generational. So if you look at the prequel trilogy for Star Wars, it's juvenile as can be compared to the original trilogy. And that's on purpose because it's supposed to showcase the innocence of the Republic before things happened.
Gotcha.
So it's sort of told through the lens of the child that, because Anakin he's sheltered the entire time. If you look at as he ages, he's still sheltered by Obi-Wan. So that's why, in Empire, when everything comes out about what happened with Luke's father and everything else and how he was once a student of Obi-Wan but turned to the dark side, that sense of failure is key and it's crucial, and that's why Empire is such a strong film, because that failure element is so much to the front of the picture. I mean, every aspect of the film, there's some sense of failure. There's the failure of Hoth. There's the failure to escape the bounty hunter. There's the failure to escape from Cloud City before the Empire closes in. There's the failure to learn the lessons of the past that Luke was supposed to do while training with Yoda. So the movie is all about failing, but not necessarily failing for bad, but failing and learning from that failure. And so in the original trilogy, or the prequel trilogy, you don't see that so much in the second film, even though it's there. It's more subtle because what the focus is on Anakin's lack of growth. So he can't see his failures, and neither can Obi-Wan. But then when you get to the new movies, they're more mature. The characters are older for the most part, minus Rey and Finn and Poe. But the other characters, the ones that everyone knows, who are also focal characters in the story, they are trying to make up for the mistakes that they've made in the past.
I know the characters are so old in some cases, the actors themselves are dead.
Yeah, I mean, but the point being is that there's a maturity to the story, even though it's the same myth. But if you don't want to see that because you've outgrown that, it becomes an issue that's burdensome. So when you do game design or even tell a story from that perspective, you have to figure out where you are in the mythic cycle for that audience and who is the key audience for that film. So I don't think the filmmakers aren't learning these lessons or aren't doing these things. I think what they're trying to do, like with Star Wars, is keep to the original model, but with other films that are either hit or miss, it's more along the lines of, did they get the formula just right?
I kind of got, when I went and seen The Last Jedi, this is purely my opinion, but I kind of got the impression that what they're trying to do is quickly and efficiently disconnect from the characters, the existing characters, the powerful existing characters, and so they can get it broke free, so they can kind of go with it inside the confines of that world, but they're trying to take the storyline someplace different and kind of break it loose from the history that we've all kind of grown up with.
And yes, that's what they're doing, but they're also showing, especially with this last one, and I think this is what hurts the most for a lot of people who wanted it to be different, is that all the characters have failed. Han Solo failed. That's why he ran away from his problems. That's why instead of being with Leia, he's out and about. Right? He failed. He blames himself for what happened to his son. Luke blames himself for what happened because he had a moment of failure. The rebellion didn't change anything, so that's seen as a failure.
Right.
That makes all of Rogue One a failure.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but that's actually based off of samurai films. So that ending is in keeping with the original trilogy.
Oh, I love it. I love the film.
Kurosawa's work.
I'm not knocking the film. I love it. And I mean, my 2 cents worth every cent you paid, so to speak, they say. For the last Jedi movie, I liked it. And there were definitely scenes in it that I don't think could have ever played out better or been more poignant. Like, for instance, the scene where R2 is showing Luke the original message that was the genesis of everything. I mean, for people who has been invested in the movie for a long time, seeing that, if it didn't pull the audience into wanting him to do it, And I don't think they could have done better with that, even though that whole scene I felt was kind of contrived in the sense that R2 wasn't to be seen pretty much before or after that scene. He was just there for that, apparently. And
he's a busy droid, man.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah, it looked like he was hanging out in the background.
Gotta cut him some slack,
Well, he's just as obsolete as the other characters.
Yeah, right. I know he's old. He ain't doing anything. And then the other thing. So I mean, that was I considered to be a strong point of the movie. There were other scenes like that too, but that's the one that really got me. And the only criticism I had of the story was that it felt like the editing was very, very quickly paced. It felt like they were trying to get an aspect of every prior movie into this movie, and I felt like there wasn't that many scenes that were long drawn out scenes of people talking or dialogue or anything like that, and it was very, very choppy in the editing sense. But overall, I thought it was great.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It kind of feels like it's being hurried.
Yeah,
like
definitely.
They're trying to hurry it along.
But almost all movies feel like that to me.
Yeah.
I would watch a movie for 4 or 5 hours if I could.
So
well, keep in mind that that's supposed to help with the theme too of like trying to outrun the Imperial fleet.
Yeah, I hear that there's a new movie that Spielberg is releasing called, I think it's called The Pentagon Papers, or it's about the Pentagon Papers, one of the two. But he's The Post. Okay, yeah. I heard that he hurried to release it because he wanted it to be released in these particular times, and that the only thing historically inaccurate about the movie in general was that the pacing of it. They said in the movie it made them feel like they were rushing to get this information to the appropriate people when in fact these newspapers had sat on these papers for a very long time.
Yeah, and well, you got to keep in mind that the magic of film and all that editing doesn't tell you how long of a break there's been between situations.
Sure.
Yeah. Me and my son has been watching Star Trek chronologically, and we were having that discussion that, there's more than one day between each episode in a lot of occasions.
Yeah,
it used to be a week on television.
You have that issue with storytelling that I think gets missed as well for some people, is that we're so used to the way television format works, where like a commercial break doesn't necessarily mean any time passed. Other than like, oh, hey, they went and used the bathroom or they went to the store, right? So there's almost no sense of a passage of time. So that's the format that most people are used to because that's the ubiquitous format of entertainment is television.
Right. So Richard, where do you...
It feels different.
Given kind of what you're saying about... It sounds to me like, it's just trying to find a way to put new lipstick on the same old pig at this point when it comes to game design and stuff. Where do you see this all going?
Well, there's different directions. I mean, like Eric was talking about earlier, there are still a lot of people dedicated to first edition. In fact, there's a whole movement called the OSR, Old School Revival, or Old School Renaissance, depending on who you ask. That's all they do. Because of the open game license that Atkinson created was fundamental in revitalizing gaming as we know it, but it also made everybody go their different directions to play the game they wanted to play.
So you see that as a positive thing?
Oh yeah, definitely. Because
okay.
Well, it brings more people into the market, even though it means that the fan base for any one game is going to be smaller than what it used to be when there were fewer games. But the upside of that is that every person has the ability to find the game that fits them best.
Yeah, sometimes
so, I mean, to me, that's actually a positive.
I
might not like the games that are out for certain things because of fundamental issues that I have with the design philosophy and what the subtext says, but overall, that is the best thing to happen to the gaming industry.
But it kind of fractures it, though, right? It kind of has the ability. Right. I get what you're saying. Every peg can kind of find a hole here, but what you're not seeing is large budgets. Maybe I'm wrong, but you're not seeing large budgets being put into development anymore because of that, right? Because it's so diluted.
Yeah, you were going to talk about today's production issues, and we never really touched upon that, and this is a good segue into that.
Yeah, and well, for instance, with my own stuff, I don't have any money. I can't afford to pay for art, but I know a lot of people who put out products that they either can, and so they can do these really slick projects, and they look great, but how many people are going to buy them? I mean, I understand that to have a large sale, you have to have good production values, like good art, good editing, good layout, all that stuff. But at the same time, if you're trying to put out the best product you can, and given that the market has changed so more people are able to come in and enjoy the hobby and find whatever works best for them, the less art that's available to me is better. Not because I don't like artists because of the pricing, but because of the imagination issue.
You're right. It's assigning an interpretation that takes that away from the person that's buying the content or buying the game world, right?
Yes, and so for me, it's trying to find the balance between production values and the writing, so that way it's free form enough that players can make the decisions for themselves what things should look like or how they imagine those details to be, with enough art to give them a sense of how they can imagine those worlds. Not so much telling them what they look like, but how they can make them look.
Right, so not necessarily having a painting of every monster in the monster manual.
Yeah, or go back to the old school monster manual for first edition where the aerial servant had no picture. Gotcha.
Or like even in third edition when they actually showed a picture of a 10-foot pole.
Yeah,
I'm not sure why they did that.
It's a wooden stick that's 10 feet long. I mean, what more do you need to know? I mean, if you can't imagine a wooden pole in this day and age, I don't know what to tell you. I mean,
right, I know, yeah.
Go look at any staircase.
My first response was, pole arm? No.
Yeah. I mean,
okay.
And that's where good art is is valuable. But when you're trying to describe something that people don't know today, like Eric was saying, pole arms, right? Because that was something that Gary was an expert on, and historians contacted him about his knowledge of pole arms.
Yeah.
If you're trying to capture some of the feel of technology of a medieval world where arms and equipment have kind of entered an experimental phase, alongside the use of magic or other technologies, you want to have as much of a diversity as possible to represent the different directions nations have gone to produce what they think is the best rock, paper, scissors game that they can play when it comes to combat. and that's what the technology represents. So if you have a hook bill or Beck de Corbin or a Rancer or whatever, these are all important items for different countries and their tactics.
Yeah.
And so that gives you a way to imagine how these people would fight if they have to go to war. And the problem is, if you don't have drawings of those words mean absolutely nothing.
Yeah, because the nomenclature is obscure at best and generally foreign, like French.
Yeah. I mean, a military fork is a pitchfork with the middle tine removed. But who cares?
I would think, though, that it should be easier, right, today, given you don't necessarily have to go printed text anymore, right? So, and instead of, you could reference art or imagery, open source reference art and imagery and stuff like that, could you not?
Well, and also
you can use public domain work. I've used several paintings that best represent certain types of subjects.
Okay.
I wrote a book on archetypes for a professor, and I used a cover of Thetis dipping Achilles in the river Styx.
So that all that was left was his ankle or his foot?
Well, no, you see her holding him by the foot or by the ankle, dipping him into the river. But that was the cover that I chose for the book. And the reason for that is because it's an archetype. And since the subject matter of the book is archetypes, it just fit. Recently, I just released a character class called the Tribune for Pathfinder. It's basically a lawful neutral paladin. So they only care about the law, right? So they're not really trying to enforce it for benevolence or for tyranny. They just care about the law for the sake of the law.
Right.
And so for the cover, it's an image of St. George slaying the dragon.
Gotcha. Metaphor for law-defeating chaos.
Yeah. So it's, law over chaos. One of the products I'm working on right now, I'm thinking of using an image from William Blake for a lawful evil paladin character that I'm working on called the Martinet, which is basically a disciplinarian.
I was going to ask you, could you give us a list of all the current projects that you've got underway, even if you haven't worked on them, and if you plan on working on them in the near future?
Several things I got going on. I'm working with one guy named Jason Tinky to work on a world of his where we're starting with the Stone Age, and it's going to move through different time periods up into a Renaissance-era level of technology for fantasy. I'm doing some 13th Age projects with a developer. It's a cyberpunk game system that he's creating using 13th Age rules. And I don't have a name for that one right now, but I worked on the Cloak and Coin setting for him for detailing one of the 6 cities in the Confederacy that's the cornerstone of the game world. Trying to finish the Castle Builder book, but unfortunately, space issues and the carpal tunnel that I have, makes a big difference as to what I can do at any one moment. But
sure,
it's the maps that are the slowest part, because that requires more expertise and level of detail than for me than writing, because it's easy for me to churn out words because I've been doing it for so long. But other than that, I'm doing a rewrite of the planar book that I did. So there's going to be a new version of Cosmos Builder that is currently called Codex Calia et Efernia. So basically Latin for the Book of Heavens and Hells.
Nice.
And I've done some Starfinder material that I just released. One of them was for my partner Diana, and because she's very much into mustelids. I actually have family members who like mustelids as well, like otters and stuff. So I created a race for that for the weasel family, and doing some write-ups of basically paladins of every alignment for Pathfinder. And I'm putting them out as soon as I finish them in terms of the class, and then later on I'm going to go back and update them to add more items to them, like feats, archetypes, whatever, and grow those as products. And then I have my own role-playing game system I've been working on for over 20 years.
Wow.
The Player's Handbook is over 217,000 words because it's kind of a universal setting,
Wow.
which makes it difficult to nail things down.
Sure, yeah. It's like how many pages does that roughly translate into? About
at 8-point font, that's about with at least 2 columns per page, comes out to 218 pages, I think.
Wow. And when's this going to be done?
That's yeah.
Shut up, take my money.
Given all the stuff I've been working on, because I also do writing for novels, and I have a website that I should do more blogging for, but I haven't done much lately. I also make crossword puzzles.
Yeah, I was reading that that you were talking about that on Facebook.
Well, here's your chance, man. Talk to us about your website. You can put a plug in here for your blog or...
Yeah, my blog is basically my name, which is richardtbalsley.com. And I talk about game design and from the aspect of analyzing as the anatomy of game design, which is a series in and of itself, looking at things like how dice work, like one series on the math and language issue, aspects of precision in gaming, whatever kind of fits in there. I've done one about Sid Meier and the effects he's had on gaming, even though it's not him directly, because it's a concept that predates his design work, but because of his use of tech trees, people associate tech trees with him because he made them visible.
I do.
So well, yeah, but I'm saying, like,
yeah, me too.
I mean, before civilization, most people didn't consider tech trees as being a fundamental part of certain types of games. Like Monopoly has a tech tree, chess has a tech tree.
Yeah,
it might not strike you as one, but it's a tech tree. When you get a pawn across to the other side and you exchange it for another piece, that's like going up a level of technology. So I talk about those kinds of things. I also talk about child development and how that works with teaching game design, because 21st century skills for design work requires a little bit more hands-on, experimentation than what most subjects allow you to do by themselves, whereas game design gives you an ability to play with concepts the way you were talking about with engineering, to test things until they fail. Because once a child learns how to master a certain concept, they can run with it and push it to its limits, which is essentially what we do, especially when we get to the level of college or as professionals. Our jobs are to push the limits and find how we can improve the things that already exist.
Absolutely.
So I talk about that kind of stuff. I sometimes write about observations of different genres and post some of my puzzles on my website, as well as
nice.
There's a meter for all the different projects that I have ongoing.
Oh, that's good.
Where you can see the level of progress, or like how much of a percentage of things are done. And then there's a page that I need to update now because of the new stuff I've done. But I have a page for the bibliography where you can go find the items that are published.
Now, speaking of such, what are the current places that one can go and purchase your products?
Currently, all of my work is available on Drive-Thru RPG, so there are no physical products at the moment. for the things that I know that are released. Otherwise, for the things that I'm producing myself, I'm trying to get some of them, or at least the textbook, on Amazon. I just haven't finished some of the formatting things that I need to do to make sure that it works the way that I want, to include logos and most of the boring business decisions that people don't care to hear about.
Right on. Cool. Man, I want to thank you for coming on the show and talking with us about all these aspects. It was awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd really like
for
to.
having me.
I think if you're up for it, there's a lot of subjects here that we could take a deep dive into individually, even in the future for separate podcasts. I mean, because there's this, like I said, this is a genre at this point, right? There's tell-all books.
Yeah.
But
there's also history and technology and art.
Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Much left uncovered.
Yeah, much left uncovered. Well, buddy, I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're busy and coming out and spending some time with us here to talk about the subjects. And I think that's pretty much it for tonight. We did really good. We kept it just under 2 hours this time. But we'll definitely reach out to you again, Richard. If you come up with anything you'd like to talk about, let us know. We'd love to have you on again. Anything you'd want to elaborate on in the future? Sound like a deal?
Yeah, it sounds like a deal.
All right, well, that's the show tonight, folks. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you all next time.